The year is 1950, New York City. The air is thick with neon, cigarette smoke, and the faint, lingering scent of peril. On the surface, the Obsidian Club was the jewel of the Lower East Side, a dazzling cabaret where fortunes were made and secrets were buried deep beneath the polished mahogany floor. But lately, the spotlight has shifted from the starlets' song to a chilling, spectral performance. Waitresses whisper of phantom applause in empty rooms, and the club's new owner, Mr. Elias Vance, reports a sinister entity, a figure in a pinstripe suit vanishing before his very eyes, leaving behind the distinct, icy chill of a freshly dug grave. Patrons are fleeing, the music is dying, and the club is hemorrhaging cash. They say he was a notorious gangster from the Prohibition-era, gunned down in a messy turf war, his ghost now guarding a buried secret. Detective Kane Bones, the city's last hope against the impossible, has just taken the case. He's about to step onto a stage where the dead still demand a final curtain call. In the urban labyrinth of New York City, where progress was measured by skyscrapers and tragedy was swept under the rug, there existed a realm of shadows beyond the city's electric glow. This was the world of Detective Kane Bones. Not a man of badges and handcuffs, but of intuition and a chilling, uncanny ability to see beyond the veil. A veteran of the city's strangest woes, Kane Bones operated from a discreet, smoke-filled office off Canal Street, his reputation built on solving the impossible. Cases where the law ended and the paranormal began. The year 1950 was supposed to be an era of clarity, of post-war optimism, but the old ghosts of the city were proven harder to bury than ever. The Obsidian Club case, code-named the Phantom Gangster, arrived on a rain-slick Tuesday. The caller was a man barely holding on to his composure. Elias Vance, a nervous, middle-aged proprietor who had sunk his entire inheritance into the club. He detailed apparitions, cold spots that defied physics, and, most disturbingly, the spectral echo of a 1930s-era Tommy gun being cocked in the darkness. The legend was clear. The club was built over the secret hideout and final resting place of a powerful, murderous mobster named Silas the Shark Moretti. Silas had a reputation for brutality and a rumored hidden stash of ill-gotten gains. Kane Bones saw past the sensationalism to the stark truth. A powerful, earthbound entity was tied to a physical object or location, and it was terrorizing the living. This wasn't just a haunting, it was a deadly, unfinished business. Kane grabbed his worn satchel, containing his custom-made silver divining rods and his trusty notebook, and headed for the Lower East Side. The cabaret was waiting, and the dead were ready to dance. If you've made it this far, the shadows haven't caught you yet. Click the like button and subscribe so you don't miss any more in-depth analysis of the unexplained files. And now, the question I most want to know. Tell me in the comments what city and country you're watching this story from. I'd love to know how far these hauntings are going. And continue with the story of Kane Bones.
The relentless rain of November 1950 did not cleanse New York City. It merely slicked the grime with a dangerous sheen, turning the cobblestones of the Lower East Side into treacherous, shining mirrors, reflecting the frantic neon of a city that never dared to sleep. Detective Kane Bones stepped out of the yellow checker cab, his worn leather boots splashing into a puddle of oil and rainwater. He adjusted the collar of his trench coat, pulling it tighter against the biting wind that howled down the alleyway like a lost soul. He wasn't a man who enjoyed the nightlife, at least not the kind that involved overpriced gin and forced laughter. His business was with the silence that came after the music died, with the things that lingered in the shadows when the spotlights were extinguished. He stood before the Obsidian Club. Once, in the roaring 20s, this building had been a warehouse, then a speakeasy known as the Blind Tiger, and now, under the ownership of Elias Vance, it was attempting to be a respectable cabaret. The attempt was failing. The marquee, which should have been blazing with the promise of jazz and escapism, flickered pathetically. The letter B in Obsidian buzzed with the angry drone of a dying fly, casting an intermittent strobe light on the wet pavement. Kane checked his pocket watch, a heavy silver piece that had stopped keeping perfect time years ago, much like Kane himself. It was midnight, the witching hour for the desperate and the damned. He pushed open the heavy oak double doors. They groaned on their hinges, a sound too heavy for a place of entertainment. Inside, the transition was jarring. The air was not warm and inviting. It was stagnant, carrying the distinct, layered sense of stale tobacco, cheap perfume, and something underneath it all, something metallic and earthy, like a handful of wet copper pennies. The club was cavernous, designed to seat 200, but tonight it was a tomb. The tables were set with white linens that looked gray in the dim light. The chairs were empty, turned inward as if gossiping among themselves. Detective Bones, a voice cracked through the silence. Elias Vance emerged from the shadows near the bar. He was a man in his early 40s, but the last few months had carved deep ravines into his face. His tuxedo was expensive, but ill-fitting, hanging loosely on a frame that had shed weight too rapidly. He clutched a tumbler of amber liquid with a hand that trembled so violently that the ice chimed against the glass. "Thank God. I didn't think you'd come. The precinct laughed at me. They said I was looking for an insurance payout. They said I was cracking up." "I don't care what the precinct thinks, Mr. Vance. I care about what you see when you're alone in the dark. Tell me." Kane's voice was a low rumble, a sound grounding enough to stop Elias's trembling for a second. Kane placed his satchel on a nearby table. It didn't contain badges or handcuffs. It held salt, silver, and a journal filled with things that defied logic. Elias swallowed hard, draining his drink. "It started small. Cold spots. You'd walk through the dining area, and suddenly it would feel like you walked into a meat locker. Then the lights. They don't just flicker, Detective. They pulse, like a heartbeat. But last week changed everything." Elias led Kane toward the stage, stopping 10 feet away, as if an invisible barrier held him back. "I was closing up. The staff had gone. I was counting the till behind the bar. I heard a noise, a distinct sound, click-clack, like a weapon, a heavy, mechanical weapon being loaded." Elias wiped sweat from his brow, despite the chill in the room. "I looked up. The stage was empty, but the curtain, the velvet curtain, was moving, rippling, as if someone was pushing through it. And then I saw him, just for a second, in the reflection of the mirror behind the bar. A man. He was wearing a pinstripe suit, wide lapels, 1930s style. He wasn't transparent, Bones. He looked solid, but he was gray. Everything about him was gray, and he was bleeding, a dark stain spreading right here. Elias tapped his own chest over his heart. He looked at me in the mirror. His eyes, they weren't angry, they were hungry. And then the mirror shattered, just exploded outward. Kane walked past the terrified owner and stepped up to the edge of the stage. He placed his hand on the wood. It was freezing, not just cold, but unnaturally icy, drawing the heat from his skin instantly. The air pressure here was heavy, pressing against his eardrums. "This isn't a residual haunting, Mr. Vance," Kane said softly, his eyes scanning the empty dark above the rafters. "Residuals are like recordings. They don't interact. They don't break mirrors. This is an intelligent haunting. Whatever is here, it's trapped, and it's losing patience. You mentioned the history of this place. Who owned it before the war?" "Silas Moretti. They called him the Shark. He ran the booze trade in this district. He vanished in '32. People said he went to Cuba, but the rumors said he never left the building." Kane nodded, the pieces beginning to form a picture. A violent man, a sudden disappearance, a haunting that manifested with the sounds of violence. "Go home, Mr. Vance," Kane ordered, opening his satchel. "Lock the doors. I'm going to spend the night. If Silas Moretti is here, he and I need to have a conversation." The following morning, the rain had ceased, leaving behind a gray, suffocating fog that clung to the East River. Kane Bones had survived the night at the Obsidian Club, but sleep had been impossible. The activity had been constant, footsteps pacing the length of the stage, the distinct smell of cigar smoke manifesting from thin air, and the overwhelming sensation of being watched from the shadows. But to truly understand the intent of the spirit, Kane needed to speak to the person who had been the focus of its most public manifestation. He needed the human element. He found Lila Monroe in a cramped, drafty boarding house in Brooklyn. It was a far cry from the glamour of the stage. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and damp wool. Lila sat in a worn armchair by the window, staring out at the gray street. She was 25, a woman of striking beauty that was currently dimmed by exhaustion and trauma. Her hands were wrapped tightly around a mug of hot tea, her knuckles white. She jumped when Kane knocked on the open door frame. "Miss Monroe?" Kane asked gently, removing his hat. "I'm Detective Bones. Elias Vance sent me. I need to talk to you about the night you quit." Lila didn't tell him to leave. She seemed relieved, as if she had been waiting for someone to validate her sanity. She gestured for him to sit on the edge of the unmade bed. "Elias thinks I'm hysterical," she said, her voice raspy. "He thinks I saw a shadow and panicked. But he wasn't on that stage, Detective. He didn't feel it." "Tell me what you felt, Lila," Kane urged, taking out his notebook. "Don't leave out the details that seem strange. The strange details are usually the truth." Lila took a deep breath, her eyes losing focus as she drifted back to that night. "It was the second set. The club was full. I was singing Stormy Weather. I know that song backwards and forwards. I closed my eyes for the high note on the bridge. When I opened them, the sound was gone. The band was playing.
I could see the drummer's arms moving. I could see the audience clapping, but I couldn't hear anything. It was like being underwater. Absolute silence. She shivered, pulling her cardigan tighter. Then the smell hit me. It wasn't the usual smoke and perfume. It was copper. Strong, dirty copper, like when you hold a handful of old pennies in a sweaty poem. And blood. I know that smell, detective. My father was a butcher. It was the smell of raw meat. Kane scribbled copper/blood in his notebook. Olfactory manifestations were rare and specific. Copper often indicated money, coins, or blood. Both fit the profile of a mob hit. And the figure? Kane prompted. He was standing right next to the piano player. He was tall. He wore a hat pulled low, but I could see his jaw. It was clenched tight, grinding his teeth. I could hear that sound, teeth grinding together, bone on bone, even though I couldn't hear the music. He looked at me, detective. He didn't look through me. He looked at me. And then he pointed. Pointed at you? No, Lila shook her head vigorously. He pointed at the floor. Specifically, the floorboards right beneath the microphone stand. He kept jabbing his finger down over and over again, and with every jab, the cold got worse. It started at my feet. It felt like ice water rising up my legs. I couldn't breathe. My throat seized up. I dropped the mic, and that's when the sound came back. A screech of feedback so loud it shattered glasses on the front tables. But before I ran, I heard him speak. Kane stopped writing. This was new information. Elias hadn't mentioned a voice. What did he say, Lila? Lila looked directly into Kane's eyes, her own wide with fear. He didn't speak with a mouth. It was like a thought pushed into my head, a growl. He said, "Under the wood, the heavy box, the traitor." That was it. I ran off stage, and I haven't gone back since. I won't go back, detective. That man, that thing, he isn't just a ghost. He's a guard dog, and he's angry. Kane closed his notebook. The puzzle pieces were locking into place. The location, center stage. The sensory details, copper and blood. The message, a specific object hidden beneath the floor. Silas Moretti hadn't just died in that building. He had been buried there. He was tethered to the earth by a specific object, a heavy box, that likely contained the reason for his betrayal. The haunting wasn't random torment. It was a desperate plea for excavation. Kane stood up, placing a hand on Lila's shoulder. "You don't have to go back, Miss Monroe. You've given me exactly what I needed. Tonight, we dig."
The city outside was asleep, or as close to sleep as New York ever got. But inside the Obsidian Club, the air was vibrating with a silent, nervous energy. It was 3 a.m., the true witching hour, the time when the veil between the living and the dead is at its thinnest. Kane Bones stood in the center of the dance floor, the tables pushed back to the walls like terrified spectators. He had extinguished the house lights, relying only on the harsh, focused beam of his heavy brass flashlight and the faint, ambient glow of the street lamps filtering through the high, dirty windows. The club felt different now. Without the pretense of music and alcohol, it felt like what it truly was, a mausoleum built of mahogany and velvet. Kane opened his satchel and retrieved his tools. He bypassed the modern gadgets. Geiger counters and thermometers were useful, but they lacked nuance. Instead,
He withdrew 2 L-shaped rods made of pure, hammered silver. Silver was a conductor, not just of electricity, but of spiritual resonance. It reacted to the ectoplasmic density that ghosts left behind, like a psychic fingerprint. Kane gripped the short handles loosely, allowing the long arms of the rods to swing freely. He closed his eyes for a moment, centering his breathing, turning his own nervous system into a receiver. "All right, Silas, show me where you fell." He began to walk the perimeter of the room, moving in a slow, deliberate spiral toward the stage. For the first few minutes, the rods remained parallel, pointing straight ahead. But as he stepped onto the wooden riser of the stage, the atmosphere shifted violently. The air grew thick, gelatinous, pressing against his chest. The silence was broken by a high-pitched ringing in his ears, a frequency that bordered on pain. As Kane approached the center stage, the exact spot Lila had identified, the silver rods reacted with sudden, violent force. They swung inward, crossing over each other to form an X. Kane took a step back. The rods uncrossed. He stepped forward. They crossed again, practically vibrating in his grip. He was standing in the epicenter of the trauma. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and died, plunging Kane into absolute darkness. But he wasn't alone. In the blackness, sensory details flooded his mind. Not his own memories, but projected echoes. He smelled the acrid burn of gunpowder, fresh and stinging. He felt a phantom impact in his back, a burning, tearing sensation that knocked the wind out of him. He heard the sound of a heavy struggle, the scuff of leather shoes on wood, and a voice, rough, panicked, and guttural, shouting, "You greedy bastard, you swore!" Then came the sound that Elias had mentioned. Click-clack. The racking of a slide on a heavy automatic weapon or a Tommy gun, followed by a dull, wet thud. The flashlight flickered back on, the beam cutting through the dust motes. Kane was breathing heavily, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the freezing temperature of the cold spot. He was standing on a grave. He knelt down, holstering the flashlight, and pulled a piece of white chalk from his coat pocket. He drew a precise circle around the floorboards where the rods had crossed. He tapped the wood with his knuckles. Thump, thump. It sounded solid. He moved 6 inches to the right and tapped again. Thock. Hollow. There was a void beneath the stage, a space that didn't appear on any blueprint Elias Vance possessed. The entity wasn't just attached to the building, it was attached to its own physical remains. Silas Moretti hadn't gone to Cuba. He hadn't run away with the money. He had been executed and shoved into a hole beneath the feet of dancing couples, his rage fermenting in the darkness for 20 years. Kane stood up, dusting the chalk from his hands. The geometry of the haunting was solved. Now came the excavation.
The next morning brought a harsh, gray light to the interior of the club. The glamour of the night before was stripped away, leaving only a dusty, tired room that smelled of stale beer and dread. Kane had called Elias Vance early, instructing him to bring tools, a crowbar, a sledgehammer, and a strong stomach. They stood on the stage, looking down at the white chalk circle Kane had drawn. "Are you sure about this, detective?" Elias asked, hefting the sledgehammer nervously. "This floor is original oak. It's gonna cost a fortune to replace." "It'll cost you more if you don't,"
Kane replied, rolling up the sleeves of his white dress shirt. "You can't exercise a secret, Mr. Vance. You have to expose it. Start prying here." Kane jammed the claw of his crowbar into the seam between two heavy planks. With a groan of straining wood and rusted nails, the board gave way. The sound was loud, violent, echoing through the empty club like a gunshot. As they worked, prying up board after board, the air in the club began to change. It wasn't just the dust rising, it was a smell that had been sealed away for decades. It was a cloying, sweet rot, mixed with the damp earth of the island and that persistent, metallic tang of copper. Elias gagged, pulling his handkerchief over his nose, but Kane kept working, his face a mask of grim determination. After 20 minutes of labor, they had exposed a hole roughly 3 feet wide and 6 feet long. It wasn't a crawl space in the traditional sense. It was a smuggler's hide, a hidey hole built during Prohibition to stash illegal liquor during raids. But now it held something far more illicit. Kane shined his light into the pit. The beam cut through the gloom and landed on a pile of fabric that had disintegrated into gray rags. But the shape beneath was unmistakable. It was a skeleton, curled into a fetal position, half buried in the dirt floor of the hideout. The pinstripe suit, though rotted, was still visible, hanging loosely off the bones. The skull was turned upward, the jaw unhinged in a silent, eternal scream. A distinct, jagged hole was visible in the temporal bone, an execution shot at close range. "Sweet Mother of God," Elias whispered, stumbling back and crossing himself. "It's him! It's really him!" Kane didn't look away. He was focused on the skeleton's right hand. The bones of the fingers were still clenched tight, fused by rigor mortis and time around a metal object. It wasn't a gun. The gun, a rusted .45 automatic, lay uselessly in the dirt near the pelvis. The hand was clutching a heavy iron lockbox, about the size of a cigar humidor. The metal was pitted with rust, but it looked incredibly strong. "He's not guarding the club, Elias," Kane said, his voice echoing in the hollow space. "He's guarding that." Kane lowered himself into the hole. The temperature dropped instantly, his breath pluming in the air. He felt a sudden, oppressive weight on his shoulders, like gravity had doubled. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the floorboards, a sound that didn't come from a throat, but from the friction of stone on stone. The ghost was close. It was watching. "I'm taking it, Silas," Kane said, firmly, addressing the empty air. "I'm taking it to find the man who put you here. You can't hold on to it anymore if you want justice." The growl subsided into a low, mournful moan, like wind whistling through a crack in a tombstone. Kane reached out and gently pried the lockbox from the skeletal fingers. It took force. The grip of the dead was notoriously strong. With a final snap of brittle bone, the box came free. He lifted it out of the grave, the weight of it surprising him. It felt dense, heavier than just paper or money. He climbed out of the hole, his suit covered in the dust of 1930. He placed the box on the stage floor. "We have the body," Kane said, wiping his hands, "and we have the motive. Now we just need to open Pandora's box and see who Silas died protecting or exposing." The lockbox sat there, an iron enigma, holding the truth that had kept a soul tethered to the earth for 20 years. Kane reached for his lock-picking tools. The investigation was about to take a turn from the paranormal to the criminal.
The iron lockbox, heavy with the burden of 20 years of secrets, sat on Kane's desk in his cramped Canal Street office. The smell of decay from the stage had clung to the metal, and the atmosphere in the room felt thick with residual anger. Kane did not use explosives of force. Silas Moretti had intended this box to be opened. Using a specialized set of lockpicks, relics of the Prohibition-era, Kane worked the tumbler with the slow, meticulous patience of a watchmaker. With a sharp final click, the heavy lid sprang open. Inside, there was no stash of diamonds or stacks of cash, frustrating the traditional expectations of a mobster's treasure. Instead, the box contained two items, a slightly mildewed leather-bound accounting ledger and a single, faded black-and-white photograph. Kane gently lifted the photograph first. It was a group shot, taken outside the very club, sometime around 1930. Three men stood shoulder to shoulder, smiling with the easy arrogance of men who believe they control the world. The man in the center was Silas Moretti, the shark, recognizable by his severe, unyielding gaze and tailored suit. To his left was a younger man, bulky and brutish, with narrow, calculating eyes. Kane recognized him instantly from old police dossiers. Victor Calloway, Moretti's ambitious, psychopathic lieutenant. The third man, however, was the most significant. A slender, sharp-featured individual wearing a meticulous three-piece suit and conspicuously a gold signet ring on his pinky finger, likely a fraternity or university symbol. His smile was cold, practiced, the smile of a predator wearing a civilian's face. Kane set the photograph aside and picked up the ledger. It was a masterpiece of organized crime. It wasn't just numbers, it was a coded diary. Page after page detailed payoffs, territories, specific deals, and, most crucially, debts. The ledger confirmed that Silas hadn't died in a random turf war. He had been betrayed, and his money, or the promise of it, had been the motive. Kane meticulously translated the coded entries, tracing the flow of illicit funds. The last entry was written in frantic, shaky cursive, dated the day of Silas's disappearance. Meeting with VC and the Scholar. They promise final settlement on the waterfront deal, $50K. They are getting greedy. If they cross me, this book goes to the DA. The ledger, therefore, was not merely an account book. It was Silas Moretti's insurance policy, his final weapon against the men who wanted him gone. The two traitors were Victor Calloway, the Muscle, and the Scholar. The university ring and the nickname pointed to someone using his legitimate education to clean up the mob's messes. Kane felt the cold radiating from the metal box intensify. The ghost of Silas wasn't haunting the club for its own sake. He was a gatekeeper, furious that his evidence had remained buried while his killers lived freely, climbing the social ladder on the foundation of his buried fortune. Kane ran his finger over the last page of the ledger, where a faint, barely legible pencil mark was visible. The initials, JTO. The Scholar had a name, and Kane knew instinctively that this name would lead him to the highest echelons of New York society. Tracing the initials JTO was a dangerous and delicate endeavor, requiring Kane to use his most discreet and morally ambiguous contacts within the city's ancient bureaucracy. Men who traded secrets for silence. After days spent sifting through university records, law school archives, and old municipal court rosters, the identity of the scholar snapped into focus. Judge Jasper T. O'Malley. O'Malley, now a towering 60-year-old figure in New York's federal judiciary, presided over some of the most sensitive cases in the country. He was known for his stringent moral pronouncements and his spotless public record. He was a pillar of the community, a patron of the arts, and a man who had successfully scrubbed every stain of his sordid Prohibition-era past. The ledger of sins showed he had been the legal mastermind for Moretti's operation, the man who knew how to turn dirty cash into clean deeds. The realization chilled Kane to the bone. Silas's rage was not directed at some back-alley thug. It was aimed at a man who sat in judgment of others, his hands still stained with the blood of his former partner. Kane knew the confession in the ledger was useless as evidence against a man of O'Malley's standing. He needed the physical proof of the payoff, or the key to the safety deposit box that Silas had clearly hidden elsewhere. He examined the final pages of the ledger again, searching for any other cryptic entry. In the margin, beneath the faint, ghostly script JTO, Kane found a single perplexing line scribbled in ink, likely added just before Silas was killed. The final key rests where the blind fish swims in the light of the stolen sea. The stolen sea. This was pure Moretti, a mobster obsessed with riddles, making his enemies work for their rewards. Kane delved into O'Malley's current public persona, finding the detail he needed. Judge O'Malley was a renowned collector of antique nautical artifacts and rare marine life. His Upper East Side brownstone was rumored to contain a massive, state-of-the-art aquarium and museum room filled with exotic, sightless creatures from the deepest parts of the ocean. The blind fish wasn't a metaphor, it was a biological fact, tied to the judge's pride. As Kane finalized his plan to infiltrate the mansion, the spectral activity peaked. The lights in his office surged and died, overloading the fuses. A shadow, tall, pinstriped, and furious, manifested briefly in the far corner, shimmering with intense cold before vanishing. It wasn't a warning, it was a demand. Silas Moretti knew Kane had the ledger, and he was using his power to force the detective's hand. Kane had to move fast. If O'Malley suspected the ledger had been found, the judge would cover his tracks completely, and Silas Moretti's soul would be condemned to eternal, restless anger. Kane packed his tools, knowing he was walking into a place far more dangerous than the shadowy cabaret, the sanctum of a respected murderer.
Judge Jasper T. O'Malley's brownstone was a fortress of wealth and good taste, its stone facade impervious to the grime of the city. Kane Bones gained entry through calculated deception and a touch of professional burglary, slipping past the silent, expensive security system under the cover of a freezing pre-dawn fog. The interior was opulent, heavy with the scent of aged leather, pipe tobacco, and sterile cleanliness, the antithesis of the dust and decay of the Obsidian Club. Kane made his way to the judge's private museum, following the faint rhythmic hum of water pumps. The room was breathtaking, and terrifying, a collector's shrine to the depths of the ocean. Walls were lined with antique diving helmets and ship models, but the dominant feature was a massive floor-to-ceiling aquarium that glowed with an eerie blue light. Inside, corals grew in muted shades, and exotic pale fish drifted lazily. Kane's eyes quickly found the blind fish, a school of small, sightless cave tetras, pale and ghostly, circling an artificial reef. The ledger's clue echoed in his mind. Rests where the blind fish swims, in the light of the stolen sea. He searched the tank's environment, focusing on the decorations the tetras consistently circled. He spotted an elaborate sculpture of a sunken treasure chest resting near the gravel bed. He couldn't breach the glass. He would be caught instantly. He needed a distraction, or better yet, a maintenance entry point. He climbed a rolling ladder situated nearby, designed for tank cleaning. Reaching the lip of the massive aquarium, he found a small, almost invisible access panel. Using a thin, flexible shim from his kit, Kane worked the locking mechanism and slid the panel open. The moist, heavy air from the tank rushed out. He reached his hand into the cold, sanitized water, feeling along the artificial coral near the treasure chest sculpture. His fingers brushed against something metallic and loose. He pulled it free, a small, tarnished safety deposit box key. At that exact moment, the lights in the museum room roared to life. The heavy oak door slammed open. "A collector of secrets, are we, Mr. Bones?" Judge O'Malley stood framed in the doorway, impeccably dressed in a silk smoking jacket, holding a heavy, antiquated revolver. His face was a mask of cold fury, the practiced smile gone, replaced by the naked greed and malice of a man cornered. "You should have stayed out of the past, detective. That place and that man died decades ago. You've only succeeded in irritating a very powerful old ghost." The judge lifted the revolver, aiming it directly at Kane's chest. "I suggest you drop whatever trinket you found and tell me where that filthy ledger is." Kane knew the game was over. He had the key, but the confrontation was inevitable, and it was taking place on the murderer's home turf.
"The ledger's is safe, Judge," Kane said, his voice calm despite the gun pointed at him. He held up the tarnished brass key for the judge to see. "And this is the last nail in your coffin. Silas Moretti always kept his best insurance in a separate account." The judge's face twisted in rage. "You arrogant fool! Silas was a sloppy animal. He's dead and buried. You think a child's game of riddles and a rotting corpse can touch me?" As if summoned by the judge's denial, the air in the room became impossibly heavy. The temperature, usually kept tropical for the fish, plunged to freezing. The colossal aquarium began to hum, the glass vibrating violently. The serene blue light turned a sickly, pulsating, spectral green. O'Malley's eyes, full of contempt just moments before, widened in primal terror. He didn't fear the law. He feared the man he thought he had successfully buried. A shape formed within the water of the tank, not a reflection, but a three-dimensional manifestation of pure rage. It was the figure of Silas Moretti, his pinstripes flowing in the water like smoke, his execution wound gaping and dark. The sight was too vivid, too terrifying for the rational mind to process. The spectral image lunged forward. With a deafening, catastrophic roar, the heavy, reinforced aquarium glass spontaneously exploded.
thousands of gallons of freezing, high-pressure water, exotic fish, and jagged glass shards erupted into the room. The force was like a tidal wave, slamming O'Malley against the wall, his expensive revolver flying across the room and clattering uselessly on the marble floor. Kane, thrown against the rolling ladder, was instantly soaked but protected by the heavy furniture. When the chaos subsided, Judge O'Malley lay on the floor, sputtering and soaked, surrounded by dying deep-sea life and the wreckage of his pristine museum. Hovering above him, for one last cold second, was the faded, satisfied silhouette of the phantom gangster. The police, alerted by the blast, and by an anonymous tip Kane had arranged moments before entering the brownstone, arrived quickly. The key led Kane to a bank deposit box containing the true evidence, a detailed, signed confession from Victor Calloway implicating both himself and Judge O'Malley in Silas's murder, along with the $50,000 owed. With the confession and the key connecting O'Malley to the stolen cash, the judge's carefully constructed empire crumbled instantly. Days later, Kane stood outside the Obsidian Club, which was now boarded up but officially designated as a historical crime scene. The building felt different. The unnatural cold was gone. The smell of copper had vanished, replaced by the mundane scent of wet mortar and clean concrete. The phantom gangster had achieved his final revenge. His spirit, no longer tethered to his buried evidence, was finally released from the violent cold of the Lower East Side.